From the very beginning, the Q, to the end, the S, that represents all of ventricular depolarization, right? So depolarization is not one point in time. Move from the septum, right, down and to the sides, and then ultimately towards the top of the ventricles, right? We went through all that. But that happens very, very quickly, and we can put an average just sort of in the middle of the QRS. Okay? And we'll do that. And then repolarization lines up with what? T wave, right? That's the ventricular repolarization. Okay, so ventricular depolarization, QRS, repolarization, T. So what's between depolarization and repolarization? Plateau, right? And therefore, contraction, right? So we can put contraction. Mind's blown? Are you okay? You feeling okay about this? Any questions? What about the valves? AV valves. Well, why not? Let's put one more thing in here. One of those AV valves was what is that? S1 or S2? S1. When do those AV valves make a sound when they open or when they close? Close. Okay. Where does that take us? Remember those heart sounds, those valve closures are the bookends for something, right? Beginning to the end of what? Yeah, beginning and the end of systole, right? So AV valve close when? The beginning or the end of systole? Beginning, right? So the ventricle builds up, it's starting to build up pressure, right? So instead of blood moving back into the atria, that valve is going to get closed as blood goes in that direction. Okay? No AV valves are going to close. Okay, semilunar valves. They're going to happen at the end of systole, right? As we begin to relax. That's a lot of stuff, isn't it? That's only half the chart, so. See, it's easier to start. Piece by piece, it's not so bad. Even when I've been looking at that thing for a lot of years, right? I look at it, Wigger diagrams, that's a lot of information, right? So I can imagine what you're thinking when you look at that. But hopefully you can see piece by piece how we can line up all these events on the cardiac cycle, right? Any questions? Okay. Let's talk volume. Yeah. All right, so I've taken some of the things away, just for simplicity here. You got our EKG at the top. Help us, we can define the beginning of systole there with that QRS, right? So I've got a couple of events here. I hope you can see what I'm pointing at. If not, we'll talk about it. But I'd like you to see if you can explain these volume changes, right? In other words, what is happening at each of these points, whether it's the change I'm showing you an arrow, or sort of a flat spot at B and C. What are these? What's happening here? Okay. See if you can take. I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes here to see if you can work out what's happening to these changes. So these are at the left here. See, left ventricular volume, right? So we're undergoing changes in volume throughout the cardiac cycle. All right. So take a few minutes and see if you can figure out what all these labels are.
ventricular ejection.
Would D or would B be end diastolic volume? Or is that not what we're talking about?
I have no idea. I don't know what B, C, and D are.
I have D. Kind of looks flattish. Maybe it's contraction. Isovolumetric contraction, maybe? For D, because it's kind of flat.
It's in,
oh, you're right, that one makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
For D.
It's a difference in volumes. I think that's what we're trying to indicate. So I don't know what that means.
The
Stroke
volume.
So then I think C and B are EDV and ESV. What about for E though?
So B and C also got like isovolumetric contraction.
You didn't put like the EDV and ESV?
I wrote both of them.
Okay.
I don't know which one. We both know.
Okay. Where should we start?
A.
Let's start with A. What's happening at A?
Contraction.
Ventricular ejection. How do you know that? Blood is leaving the ventricle, right? The blood volume is going down, so therefore we must be in ventricular ejection. Okay. Let's look at B then. What's happening there? Looks like we're in ventricular systole, right? According to what we've identified. What's happening at B? Yeah. Yeah, isovolumetric contraction. So that phase is really short, isn't it? Okay, so the isovolumetric contraction phase, we might compare it to the other part of systole. We could say that it's really small, right? So from the beginning of systole, that's a very, very short phase, okay? All right, so isovolumetric, no volume change, okay? But we're in systole. Okay, C. What's happening there? Isovolumetric relaxation, okay? Again, very short period of time. We're in diastole, right? We're beginning that resting phase, but it's a very short period of time. So, and this makes sense. The heart is in the business of pumping blood, right? Moving blood along. So the periods of time where it's not filling or ejecting should be short, right? And so these are periods where the pressure changes that are happening are very substantial, right? And that's going to lead to further volume changes. Okay. All right. So A, B, C, D. What's D representing? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, that's the stroke volume, right? So it's we could identify the maximum and a minimum, right? What would we call the maximum? Yeah, the maximum here is the end diastolic volume. The minimum is the end systolic volume, right? So D represents the stroke volume. There it is. E, what's happening there? And what's happening in F? Both are, we've got rises in ventricular volume. What do you think's happening? And why do you think that? I'm sorry, can you say it a little louder? Yeah, so the ventricular filling happens passively at first, and then is followed by filling actively as a result of the atrial systole. Okay, so E is in fact the the filling without the help of the atria contracting. And then F is the result of atrial systole. Okay. So just so you have a little bit of insight here, you could see, if you look at E, you could see that it's rising quickly and then it kind of tapers off, right? So this has to do with the pressure, right? The veins haven't been dumping their blood into the heart when the heart's been contracting, right? So as soon as the heart relaxes, right, there's enough pressure in the veins that it pushes blood into the ventricles pretty quickly. Okay. But then it starts to equal out. The pressures sort of even out a little bit, and it slows down. That's why you see sort of a fast rise and then a taper off, right? So that it's not changing in volume anymore. Okay. That's when the atria kick in, right? And they add an additional amount of volume. Okay. So, which is more, the amount of volume contributed passively or through atrial systole?
Possibly.
Passively, right? And this is why if you do have the SA node affected through an infarction, a heart attack, it's possible that you could survive. Okay? So it just depends on how much of your heart is affected, right? But if your atria aren't contracting at all, this does not mean you die immediately, right? Because a substantial amount of ventricular filling, in terms of volume, happens without the atria's help. All right, we got them all?
Mm-hmm.
Easy peasy. Any questions? All right. Seems not so bad, one thing at a time, right? Okay. Oh my gosh. So this is the last part, and it has to do with pressures. And we've been talking about pressures all along, but this is a great way to take a look at it. So one of the things I want to do to start with, we haven't talked much about the aorta, so let's talk about the aorta. We've got the aorta, and its pressure goes from, the aorta's pressure goes from high to low, okay? So if we were to measure your blood pressure, what do you call that thing? That cuff that you... Sphygmomanometer, yeah. You'll have to say that as part of your test in lab. I'm kidding, but it should be. All right. All right, so if we measure the pressure in your aorta, oops, we will see that it has a high and it has a low. Okay? And so when we measure somebody's blood pressure as, let's say, 120 over 80, what we're measuring is the difference between that high and low, the height of aortic pressure and the low. And we put that on your arm, not because your aorta runs into your arm, but you've got a brachial artery there that's a pretty sizable artery, and it's a pretty good proxy for the pressures in the aorta. Okay. So why do the pressures in the aorta rise? What makes the pressure in the aorta go up? Yeah. Right. Ventricular, well, not quite. Ventricular ejection, right? So we're filling the aorta. You're right about that, but it's ventricular ejection. Okay, so we're pushing blood into the aorta, and that raises the pressure because there's more blood in that vessel. Okay? So as pressure goes up, and if we're to describe what is the role of the heart, if you ask a elementary school kid, they'll say it pumps blood, right? What we can say, how we can refine that is basically it pressurizes the blood, okay? Because it's the pressure that moves blood, pressure difference between the beginning and the end of the circulatory system. So the ventricles are pressurizing blood. They're adding a small quantity of blood each cycle, and what they're doing is they're elevating the pressure in the aorta, okay? And then the pressure drops in the aorta. Why is it dropping? Why does pressure drop in the aorta? Yeah.
Because it pushes the blood into the rest of the body, where it comes.
Right, so that high pressure blood in the aorta moves out to the rest of the body, right? So it's not as if you have a pipe where you're putting in 60 milliliters on one side and 60 comes out the other, right? You're pushing it in and that aorta expands to take on the extra volume, right? And then as it recoils, bounces back, that blood is pushed throughout the body, okay? So that high pressure that we're creating is matched by a low pressure in your veins, right? So it's the difference that causes blood to move, right? We'll talk more about that at some point. But the aortic pressure is dropping because blood is leaving the aorta. Blood is moving from the aorta to other parts of the body, right? It doesn't empty the aorta, obviously, but some blood leaves. Okay, so that's where you see in between the activities of the heart there that the aortic pressure is slanting downward, right? It's sloping right here. Okay, all right. So that's enough about the aorta. We've got these other two chambers we want to talk about, and then we'll talk about the relationship. So the atrium, you can see its pressures don't really change much. Okay, it goes up and down a little bit, but these are pretty small pressures we're dealing with. Right. The ventricle has huge volume huge pressure changes. Okay? And those pressure changes are what we need in order to move blood. Okay? So, rule number one is blood only moves because of a pressure difference. Okay? So just like diffusion, right? We go from a high concentration to a low concentration. This time we're talking about pressure though. Okay? We move from high pressure to low pressure. That's the only thing that moves blood. Okay. All right, so let's talk our way through this and see if we can understand what's happening. So we'll take this stage by stage. Okay. So we'll start with filling. This filling's easy. So I started with ventricular filling, and what I've got in the upper left is the left side of your heart. Okay, in orange, that's atrium. Ventricle in green, aorta blue. So you can sort of visualize blood is always going to move in that direction from atria to ventricle to aorta, right? Okay, so starting with ventricular filling. We are at a state where the ventricle's pressure has previously dropped to be very low, right? And we'll discuss that. But the pressure in the ventricle here in green has dropped low. And there's an event that takes place here. If you compare the pressures here at this point, what's happening there? This is what really really defines the period of ventricular filling. What's happened here? What do you describe in words what's happened with the ventricular and atrial pressures? Yeah?
The ventricular pressure is lower than the
Yeah, the ventricular pressure has dropped below the atrial pressure. Okay? So the atrial pressure is there not because of well, the atrial pressure is a little bit elevated, right? Because we have atrial we're not in, how do I say this? We're not in atrial systole. We have pressure there due to the pressure that's in the veins feeding in. Okay? So we've got a small amount of pressure there feeding in from the veins. Right? If we were to measure this, it might be like 4 or 5 millimeters of mercury, very small, but of pressure. The ventricles have dropped below this by relaxing completely. Okay, so they relax completely, and blood can now flow from atria, the pressure is a little higher, to the ventricles. Okay, and you can see that ventricular pressure down there in green. Right. It stays low, and as we get closer along in time, or move along in time, as it's filling with blood, its pressure comes up a little bit, but these ventricles are not squeezing on that blood at all. They're completely relaxed. And then what happens, we get a little bump. atrial pressure suddenly rises. Why is that? Why is the atria suddenly? Yeah, we've entered atrial systole. Okay, so the atria have now contracted, and they build up a little bit of pressure to force more blood in, right? So you can see that those two lines were headed towards each other. Okay, atria and ventricle are headed towards each other, right? And so eventually, what would happen is you'd stop getting blood flow, right? We saw that when we looked at the volume, right? The volume change kind of tapered off. Okay, so here now we're adding a little bit more pressure to make sure we get extra volume moving in. Okay, so it's a pretty simple thing. We can describe this as we have atrial pressure higher than ventricular pressure. Both chambers are at rest, right? But we've got that venous blood draining into the atria, right? And so it's sort of pushing its way into the ventricles. And then at the end, we've got a contribution of the atria, adding a little bit extra pressure through atrial systole. All this time, nothing's happening with blood in the ventricle moving to the aorta, right? That valve is closed, the semilunar valve is closed, nothing's happening. Aortic pressure is just slowly dropping as as blood moves out of the aorta to the rest of the body. Okay. So filling's kind of boring, right? Let's get to the exciting part here. So now we're going to contract, right? So action potential has reached our ventricles. Okay, we're going to be in plateau phase and begin contracting. The onset of contraction, the ventricular pressure goes way up, right? It's going way up. So that ventricle is squeezing on the blood inside the ventricle, and its pressure is going from 1 or 2 millimeters mercury way up. Okay, it's going way up until something happens that defines the end of the stage. What's happening here? That coincides with the end of isovolumetric contraction. The valve's going to open. Why is the valve open now? Yeah, we've got a reversal of pressure, right? So before, in filling, the aortic pressure is much higher than the ventricular pressure, right? What's happened here? Ventricular pressure has built, and now it's going to surpass the pressure in the aorta. Okay? So my little diagram on the upper left, right? The pressure here is greater, right, than the pressure out here. Okay, so we have more pressure in the ventricle than in the aorta. And so what do we get when we have a pressure difference? We get movement, right? So we're going to get movement in this direction. The valve permits blood to flow through that direction. So we get an increase in ventricular pressure over aortic pressure. Valve opens up, right, and blood goes out. Right? This is what defines the end of that isovolumetric phase and the beginning of which phase?
Ejection.
Yeah, ejection. Okay. So that's what's happening here. We're just rising pressure in the isovolumetric phase until we get to the point where we overcome the aorta's pressure. Okay. Then we move into the ventricular ejection phase, and you can see whose pressure is the highest. Ventricle or aorta?
Ventricle.
Ventricle, all right? So blood's going from the ventricle to the aorta. Right? That's basically what defines this stage. And you can see the pressure is starting to drop right at the end of that. As we're turning the corner from active contraction, beginning the process of loosening up some of that contraction, right? And what do we have here? What's happened with our pressures? Ventricular pressure has done something, right? lower than what? The aortic, right? So the aortic pressure is higher because that ventricle is beginning to relax. Okay. Right? And so as soon as we get out of this phase and enter the next isovolumetric relaxation phase, we can see that our ventricular pressure is dropping due to relaxation. But how do we keep that aortic pressure high? Well, we've got a valve, right? The valve closes. And so we've transferred pressure from ventricle to aorta and blood with it. Okay. And then the ventricle relaxes, but the blood doesn't come back due to that semilunar valve. Okay. So semilunar valves prevent backflow and prevent blood from moving into the ventricle. So what's it going to take then for us to go from this stage where we've just closed our semilunar valves to the stage where we can start to fill again? What has to happen? Blood's coming in from it's going to come in from the atria, but what has to happen for that to occur? Ventricle pressure has to drop first, right? So we complete relaxation. All right, so we've got a series of volume changes here, and you can kind of summarize this stuff by talking about or thinking in terms of the pressure changes happening between adjacent chambers. Right? So I'm going to run back and summarize this real quickly. Okay. So we go from ventricular filling right here, and from filling, well, we started filling by having greater pressure in the atrium than the ventricle, right? Right? And after the ventricles have filled, we move into isovolumetric contraction. When the ventricles begin contracting, we only get out of this stage when the ventricular pressure becomes greater than aortic pressure. And then we move into ejection, which we leave when the ventricular pressure drops below the aortic pressure. Okay. And then we'll move into filling after that. We have an isovolumetric relaxation. Okay. And filling can occur when the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure. Yeah. So all of these stages we can kind of define on the basis of pressure changes. So, brain hurt yet? So I think, taking these things one thing at a time is the way to go, right? Explain what's happening at each stage. And there aren't too many concepts here. If you take a step back from how complicated all this seems, right? And this is really just about pressure changes lead to volume changes, right? And knowing when the ventricles and the atria begin to contract and when they begin to relax. Most everything can kind of fall into place. Okay? But I think the best way to go about studying this is to, before you go back and re-listen or anything like that, see if you can walk yourself through these slides like we did in class, and identify a couple of places where you're struggling. Then go back and listen. Okay? So don't just plow into the recording. But I think it might help to go back and listen to it eventually. Good question.
At what point on the pressure line would the AV valve close? Like where on this line?
Where do the AV valves close?
Yes.
On this slide, AV valves are going to be closing at the onset of ventricular contraction. So AV valves, oops, I can't point with a circle. by definition. Okay, so right here, or right here. Okay, so the atria has finished its. Let me back up here. The atria has finished its systole, right? And the ventricle is now beginning to contract. So the beginning of contraction is what's going to put that ventricular pressure over the pressure of the atrium. Are you clear about what closes valves? So it's the blood attempting to move, right? So if the blood is pushing back its way into the atrium, that is what's going to force the valve close. So it's the beginning of that pressure build up that is going to begin the movement of blood in the wrong direction, which pushes the valve close.
Could you explain the small spike in the aortic pressure during ventricular relaxation?
This one?
In the aorta.
This.
Yes.
Okay. This is called the dicrotic notch. It has a name. Your books give you this or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. What a cool term. Dicrotic notch. So basically what's happening here is we have pushed a whole bunch of blood from the ventricle into the aorta. Okay? The aorta is expanding, right? And what happens is that as soon as we, you can think of it as we're pushing this column of blood into the aorta, and there's inertia associated with that, right? We're moving a column of fluid that is both moving forward and it's expanding the aorta, okay? And when the valves close, that blood sort of, instead of moving forward, now pushes backwards, okay, for a brief period of time. And it's that relaxation of the inertia, the letting go of the kinetic energy forward momentum that causes the blood to sort of push back against the valve. So we get a little bit of a drop as the aorta relaxes, right? And then as the pressure rebounds against the heart, you get that increase. It's thought to be important for pushing blood into the coronary arteries, which are hiding behind the valve cusps.